scripture reading today will come from Colossians chapter 3, verse 8. Colossians 3 and verse 8. But now you yourselves are to put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy language out of your mouth.
Certainly appreciate your presence here this morning. It's good to be home. I wish I could express in words what coming home actually means to me, having the opportunity to do the work that we were able to do, but at the same time to return back home to the faithful congregation here at Luxahoma, and the things in which you have been engaged and the things that you continue to do, and certainly just grateful to be a part of this family. And it is certainly a privilege to have you as a family. And I hope that I never take that for granted. I hope that that will always shine through in the way that I conduct myself, but also not only through my preaching, but through just the relationships that we have built going all the way back to 2005. And so again, we are grateful that you are here this morning. There's an expression, a very, very old expression, that says, curse like a sailor. While that expression probably doesn't carry the same meaning that it did maybe 10 years ago, or perhaps 20 or even 30 years ago, there was a second petty officer by the name of Jennifer Benedict, who served on the USS Nimitz for about 2 years. And she wrote an article when she heard the idea or heard that phraseology or terminology, curse like a sailor, that she wanted to find out its origins and did all that she could searching through naval historical books to find out from whence this came. She was able to find out that the terminology or the phrase actually originated somewhere between the end of the 18th century, about the beginning of the 19th century, when a bunch of sailors began to voice their frustration over the dangerous seas in which they were guarding. Sometimes the frustration or anger would actually be demonstrated through the things in which they would say their vulgar words. Even some, she claims, were even made up to have a particular meaning that the other sailors would begin to know and to understand. And some of those have become even popular even this day. There's no doubt that the negative connotation that phraseology has carried has painted a dim portrait of a life of a sailor during that culture. Matter of fact, when you think about its effects here upon our time, and even in the 21st century, you could take that word sailor and actually replace it with just about any other character that you would like. See, all you would have to do is go down to the local grocery store and find the disgruntled customer, and you could say curses like, you fill in the blank. Or perhaps go to your local or a localized professional sporting event, and then you'll be able to see both the athlete and the spectator demonstrate their cursing skills based upon the situation of what is going on. Or perhaps just drive down to the local coffee shop and hear two local businessmen or businesswomen as they began to discuss the profitability of their particular labors in some sort of curse-laden way. Just a few days ago, on our way home from Southeast Asia, I was getting ready to board a flight in JFK Airport in New York. And sitting behind me were three businessmen, young businessmen, well-dressed. Obviously, they had been very successful or looked very successful in the things in which they were doing for a source of living, and every other word that would come out of their mouth would be a curse word. I was trying to text home and let Robin know what time I would be home. I remember just closing my computer, packing up my phone, sticking it back in my backpack, and looking at my colleague and said, "Let's go." To stay there and hear any more of that was so disheartening and frustrating. Granted, I have no idea what was going on in their lives. I don't know what their lives were up against, and I'm not trying to make excuses for them or anyone else, but I knew that it was affecting me in a way that was not good. There's too much negativity in this life to be surrounded by such. There's too much going on in this life that's not good to allow ourselves to be swallowed in by such words and filthy language. When you think about profanity in our society today, there's no doubt that it reaches far and wide through our workplaces, through our educational systems. Unfortunately, even creeps into the church if we're not careful. We're all at one time or another have said something profane and maybe not even meaning to, or perhaps, as some might say, that old way of life kind of slipped back in, and we understand that certainly can happen. Again, no excuse, but it's a reality of who it affects and why. How did we get here? How is it that we got here in this time and place in our society where it's so prevalent? While I was not even born, I remember reading of the shock of one stage actor actually using one curse word in the midst of a very popular movie. As a matter of fact, the very highest grossing movie monetarily of the time. And remember how the local newspapers and even radio stations were trying to turn the world upside down because one word was spoken that was vulgar in the minds of the majority. How did we get here? I think for us to study this from a biblical perspective, I think that we have to understand that this falls within the realm of those moral things that the Bible speaks of. Those things like lasciviousness, and it also those things like fornication. It's the idea that it falls into that realm of morality, and it must be studied, as Paul said that he would declare the whole counsel of God. And so when we think about profanity and the Christian and the effects that it has, I think the very first thing is we need to know from whence it comes. What are the causes of this? There are many adverse causes and also excuses, if you will, for profanity today. See, if you were to open a abnormal psychology book, they will tell you that there's two causes here. There's a physical and a psychological. There's a physical and there's a psychological. See, there's a physical cause of it, and it begins being exposed to people who participate in such. Sometimes it's the home. Notice these statistics, if you will, that 90% of the homes where both parents use profanity, children will also use it. 80% of homes where one parent uses it, again, the children will. Just a slight difference between 90 and 80% compared with both parents and one. In the workplace, it's said that 80% of blue-collar workers claim to be exposed to profanity on a regular, daily basis. That number jumps up to 82 when researchers reached out to white-collar workers that claim to be exposed to profanity on a regular, daily basis. In our school systems, by the time our children reach school age, anywhere between the ages of 4 and 6, studies have showed that they have a 30 to 40 word vocabulary, curse word vocabulary. If they've been exposed to these words in the home. 16 school systems were also studied, and it showed that 50% of public school teachers will use profanity in the presence of their co-workers when the children or students are not present. One study showed that our activities are affected as well, and the fact that we're exposed to those who will use profanity. 70% of male coaches who were surveyed will use profanity if they believe that it will motivate their athletes. 62% of women coaches say the same thing. But there's also not only being exposed to the people who participate in it, but there's also being exposed to the devices that promote it, that promote vulgar language. The use of profanity, one study says that the use of profanity on primetime TV of the major networks, and when I say major networks, we're not counting the cable stations. We're talking about things like ABC, NBC, CBS, PBS. That a recent survey showed that the use of profanity on primetime TV of the major networks has increased over 400% between the years of 2002 and 2023. And while social media outlets have tried to curb excessive profanity on their sites, there's no way to quantify the number. And the reason that the number cannot be quantified is because the people who have created these outlets are so overwhelmed by it, they cannot start to count. But these same researchers will go on and say that there's also the psychological causes. Some say that it brings about being pain-free. They compare it to the fight or flight response. The idea that it would come out under certain circumstances or situations. Another psychological cause is the power and control that people, they will use vulgarity or they will use profane words in such a way to show that they have control over the situation or perhaps the control over the people in that situation. Some will fall back upon the excuse that it's a nonviolent retribution. In other words, they could have exerted to violence, but they chose the nonviolent by using vulgarity. Some just chalk it up as humor. When among friends they find it, swearing can also be the source of amusement. For others, in the psychological causes, it's the peer and social bonding. See, they have a sense of belonging. I want to belong with this group. This is the way they talk, and so I begin to talk like them. Again, at that exposure. But there's also self-expression. What I mean by that is, or what these individuals mean by that, is the fact that it's the self-expression in the sense that someone is trying to make their point about what they believe or what they're trying to say, and so they'll use vulgar language in order to do that. But this is the one that really threw me off. There are literally psychologists today who say that using vulgar language improves psychological and physical health. What they don't say, I think you're probably more interested in that, right? What they don't say is that they actually monopolize the health benefits that they were looking for. Things like stress relief, the ability to sleep, the ability to have more confidence, the ability to relate. What they don't tell you is that there's 1,857 other things from the psychological standpoint that are not sinful that will actually allow someone to have those benefits. It's almost like we're creating a society that says that this must be acceptable. And unfortunately, even within the realm of Christianity, we find people who are trying to make this acceptable. And while some of us may be guilty of that, and I can stand in the guilty line from my past and certainly understand that there might be many others who can do the same thing, but at the same time, we need to understand that this exposure does not benefit our society in the least, but rather paints a disturbing picture, much like the expression, curse like a sailor, or like a disgruntled customer, or like a businessman at a coffee shop, or a blue-collar worker, or a white-collar worker, or an athletic coach, or a teacher. There's also the altered correction for profanity. You have the adverse causes and excuses of profanity. There's also the altered correction for profanity. See, altering certain words give people some comfort. See, what they'll do is they'll say a word that's similar to the curse word, thinking that I didn't actually say the word, therefore I have avoided sin. That terminology is called a euphemism. It's certainly something that substitutes or takes the place of another. From an etymology standpoint, it certainly can be just that. It's a replacement. And if you were to think about some of the things that you and I began to use in our everyday lives, even as children of God, the things that we say are just replacement words for what the world uses in a vulgar sense. This is not an exhaustive list, but just take probably some of the most popular ones. You heard the expression, my God. You remember when Moses came down from Mount Sinai with those tablets upon which God with his finger wrote the 10 Commandments. You remember the very first commandment in which was given, thou shalt have no other gods before me. But what was the second? Thou shalt not take the name of the Lord thy God in vain. Exodus 20 and verse 7. To find other euphemisms concerning God and His goodness, all you have to do is open Merriam-Webster's dictionary and actually look through at how the origin of these words came about. The word like gosh, G-O-S-H, gosh. It's a euphemistic substitute for God, according to Webster's. It had its origin in the fact that some people felt uncomfortable using God's name in vain, but they still wanted to express it like the world did, and its origins found it in a way of just respelling the word, but having the same meaning. How about this one? Goodness. Or you put it together with this other, goodness gracious. Substitute for the goodness of God. Again, according to Webster. God's goodness. And the fact is that we didn't want to say, good God. But rather, we found a way to substitute the fact without thinking that we were taking the name of God in vain. This is the one that stuck out to me the most, and I didn't even think about it until I started researching this, but the word G, or G's, the euphemistic substitute for Jesus, the Son of God. Those in the world would use the name Jesus Christ as though it was some sort of statement trying to prove whatever point that they were trying to say, and they would utter those words, Jesus Christ. Even to the point where some comedians were taking that in that sense and started saying that they thought their names were that from their parents all their lives, because every time they did something wrong, their parents would say, Jesus Christ. The last one, darn. That's a euphemistic substitute for the word that actor used in that movie, of which the world was up in arms, to where some countries would not even show the movie because it had that word. And because it was so vulgar at the time, we just found a substitute. And notice, if you were to take any of these words and put them together, you could come up with the true meaning from the vulgarity standpoint, couldn't you? Certainly. The alter correction for profanity is not to substitute the word, it's just to stop. Sometimes people who use cuss words, who use vulgar language, are oblivious to the fact that they're even doing it. I remember when I first left Memphis School of Preaching, I went back for a short time and worked with the company that I'd worked for years. And I remember being in that workforce, and I was training a young man that was trying to move through management, or trying to go through the program this company had set up. And every other word out of his mouth, and it was such a shock factor, because I had been sheltered perhaps within the friendly confines of preaching school, and every friend that I had was a Christian. Every conversation I had for 2 years was basically with Christians, and every topic that we were talking about had to do with Christianity. And then suddenly I'm exposed to this area, and I remember just asking him, do you hear yourself? And his response was he had no idea that he was saying those things. Then when he found out that I was a preacher, he thought he was going to hell. Why would that have even made a difference? But that's the way our society looks at words. You know, the old sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt us. And there's nothing more untrue than that statement. And from the standpoint of looking at what it means to use this vulgar language, at the very least it hurts me when I say it, but it also exposes those around me to a frustrating life that we never meant for others to have. So that's why when we come to this last point, there's the absolute condemnation for profanity. First of all, there's the command. In Ephesians chapter 4 and verse 29, here Paul says this, let no corrupt communication proceed out of your mouth, but that which is good to use for edifying, that it may minister grace unto the hearers. Again, Ephesians 4 and verse 29. Well, Paul was trying to encourage the brethren there. They had the opportunity and responsibility to build each other up. But the idea is that their speech was anything but that. As a matter of fact, there's an implication here that there was a tearing down in the process. Could it have been vulgar language? It may have been. Does the principle apply? Absolutely. And so God condemns it, and He says that that should not proceed out of your mouth, this filthy language or this filthy communication. But notice this in James chapter 3 and verse 10. He said, out of the same mouth proceeding blessings and cursings. My brethren, these things ought not be. In other words, how can one talk like a Christian sometimes and then talk like the world the next? How can he be a blessing to some on one hand and then be a cursing to another on the other? How can that be? Well, James says it's possible, but the idea is that it ought not to be that way. And so therefore, we have to think before we speak, right? That's why James would say later on that we ought to be quick to hear, slow to speak. How about the passage that was read for us a few moments ago as Paul was trying to eliminate these things that were holding these Christians back. And he says, but now ye also put off all these: anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of thy mouth. You know, it's amazing. Even the King James, if you go all the way back to 1611, uses the actual terminology filthy. And when you consider that time period, filthy would have a completely different meaning. Filthy would be something within the realms of decomposing. That it would have within the realms of rotting flesh. And yet it's used here concerning language, concerning words. So the idea of letting this filthy language come out of our mouths, that has to be eliminated. Why? Because the command, if not followed, brings about condemnation. Open your Bibles, if you will, to Romans chapter 3. Romans chapter 3. We'll read this together. And I want you to notice, if you will, some of the comparisons that Paul makes. Now, remember, Paul is trying to show that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. That's what he's going to say in verse 23, right? And in chapter 6, he's going to say that the wages of sin is death. But notice all of these things that he compares as he's describing sinfulness. And so, in Romans chapter 3, begin reading with me in verse number 9. When he says, what then? Are we better than they? No, in no wise, for we have before proved, both Jew and Gentile, that they are all under sin. As it is written, there is none righteous, no, not one. There is none that understandeth. There is none that seeketh after God. They are all gone out of the way. They are together become unprofitable. There is none that doeth good, no, not one. Now watch. Their throat is an open sepulchre. With their tongues they have used deceit. The poison of asp is under their lips, whose mouths is full of cursing and bitterness. Their feet are swift to shed blood. Destruction and misery are in their ways, and the way of peace have they not known. There is no fear of God before their eyes. Now we know that what things soever the law saith, it saith to them that are under the law, that every mouth may be stopped, and all the world may become guilty before God. And so he points out, number one, did you see it? The idea of what comes out of a person's mouth in this particular case, that both the Jew and the Gentile was guilty of this. The idea of deceit, but the idea of the cursings and bitterness. And it's compared or actually equal to the feet that run to shed blood, to commit murder. The idea is that when we see the seriousness of the things in which we say, he's trying to show how devastating the condemnation has to be. But think about these words. When Zechariah, back in the Old Testament, said in Zechariah chapter 5 and verse 3, then he said unto me, this is the curse that goeth forth over the face of the whole earth. For every one that stealeth shall be cut off on his side, according to it, and every one that sweareth shall be cut off on that side, according to it. The word sweareth here is not speaking of swearing an oath, but rather it's the idea to tear apart, to attack. That's why Jesus would say on this occasion in Matthew chapter 12, but I say unto you that every idle word that men shall speak, they shall give an account for in the day of judgment. For by the words that they shall be justified, and by thy words they shall be condemned. Matthew 12, verses 36 and 37. The word idle there, sometimes we think those things that we didn't say. But actually, these are words of no profit. Those things that tear down, those things that frustrate, those cuss words that cause us literally to tremble because of their meaning and their effect behind them. This morning, when you think about our lives as Christians, when we think about our lives as Christians, there's a lot to consider, even from the things in which we say. The words that we use, they're going to affect us in some way, either in a positive way or a negative. And so we need to understand the idea of profane language or just profanity in general. We can say it in other words like vulgar language. But I want you to think about something. I had an instructor a long time ago tell us that the things that we watch on TV, the things that we watch in movies, the language and stuff that we hear them say, there's not one of those people that if they were to walk out of that screen, out of that movie, out of that TV show, out of that sporting event, would we ask them to sit down and have supper with us. That's what exposure does. We might not use it, but we can get so used to it that it no longer frustrates us. We have to remember the adverse causes and excuses of profanity. But we also have to understand what God has put before us in the altered correction. We can't just change the word when it has the same meaning. But then also we have to think about the absolute condemnation. God's given us a command to remove those things, and the condemnation will be serious if we don't. It's another part of our moral upright in having us stand before God pure and justified in His sight. Yes, even our words can cause our souls to be lost. If you're here this morning and not a child of God, listen to the words of truth. When Jesus said, he that believes and is baptized shall be saved, but he that believes not shall be condemned. Mark 16 and verse 16. It may be that I'm speaking to a child of God, that you have sin or sins in your life. Maybe it's your words. Maybe it's the life that you're communicating through those words that are frustrating to you and obviously frustrating to God. Turn your life around now and allow God's pure speech to be placed in there through His holy and divine word, knowing that God is just, He will forgive when we confess those wrongdoings, even the words of our tongue. Won't you come as together we stand and as we sing?